The planet of Veritha's Edge had seen better days. Once it was a busy trade world. Ships came and went. Markets were full of noise and color. Different species walked the same roads and argued over prices and shared meals under open skies. It was not a beautiful planet. The air was dry, the ground was pale brown dust, and the sun was too far away to give much warmth, but it was alive. It had energy. It had purpose. That was before the war. Nobody called it a war officially. The official people used words like conflict, and border dispute, and military action. But the people who lived on Veritha's Edge knew what it was. They watched the ships stop coming. They watched the markets empty out. They watched buildings burn and roads crack and the dust slowly take back everything that hands had built. Most people left when they could. Packed what they had and found somewhere else to be. Somewhere that still had a future. The ones who stayed were the ones who had nowhere else to go. There were maybe 300 of them now, scattered through the broken streets like seeds that had fallen in bad soil. Different species, different stories, same basic problem. Not enough of anything and too much silence. They kept to themselves mostly. Nodded to each other in the market. Did not ask too many questions. That was how you survived on a dying world. You kept your head down. You did your part. You did not get involved in things that were not your business. Elias Cord was very good at not getting involved. He was a human man, somewhere in his middle years, with a face that looked like it had spent a lot of time squinting into sunlight and a pair of hands that were always slightly dusty. He was not tall. He was not particularly strong. He had a quiet way of moving through spaces, like he was always aware of how much room he was taking up and trying not to take too much. People who passed him in the street often forgot they had seen him at all. He did not seem to mind this. His workshop was on a small side street near the edge of what used to be the main market. It was a single room with a wooden workbench, 2 shelves full of small tools, and a window that let in just enough pale light to work by. On the shelves and hanging from small hooks on the walls were toys. Wooden birds with wings that moved when you pulled a string. Small carved animals with smooth round bodies. Simple puzzles made from interlocking pieces of pale wood. Figures of different species, painted carefully in colors that had faded only a little with time. He made them for the children still living on Veritha's Edge. He fixed the broken ones that children brought to him. He charged almost nothing for any of it, sometimes a little food, sometimes nothing at all. He did not seem to think this was unusual. It was just what he did. On the day everything changed, Elias was sitting at his workbench carving a small bird. It was going to be a gift for a Thurvian child who had recently lost her favorite toy in a dust storm. He was taking his time with the wings, making them light and thin so they would catch the air properly when she held it up and ran. The workshop was quiet. Dust moved slowly in the pale light from the window. Outside, the streets were mostly empty, as they usually were in the middle of the afternoon. He did not hear anything unusual at first. Then he heard running. Small feet, fast, slapping against the packed dust of the street outside. Then the door of his workshop flew open so hard it hit the wall, and a small 4-armed creature stumbled in and grabbed the edge of his workbench with 2 of her hands to stop herself from falling over. Her name was Senna. She was a Keth child, a species that stood about waist-high on a human adult, with 4 arms, large dark eyes and skin the color of pale clay. She was 7 years old or something close to it. She had been coming to Elias's workshop for almost a year, sometimes to bring him broken toys from other children, sometimes just to sit on the small stool in the corner and watch him work. She did not always talk much. She was a quiet child usually. She was not quiet now. Her eyes were huge. Her 4 hands were shaking. She was trying to say something but the words were coming out tangled and too fast and on top of each other. Elias put down his carving tool. He did not tell her to slow down or calm down or take a breath. He just turned to face her fully and waited. He looked at her the way he always looked at things he was trying to understand, steady, patient, like there was no rush in the world. After a moment Senna's words found their order. There was something in the alley behind the old grain storage building. Something very large. She had seen it on her way back from the far market. It was lying in the dust. It was not moving much. It was breathing. She had seen the chest moving, but the breathing sounded wrong. Like something was broken inside. And it was big. Very big. Bigger than anything she had ever seen lying down in a street. She said it was a dragon. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her one question. He asked if she thought it was still alive. Senna said yes. She thought so. She hoped so. Elias nodded once. Then he stood up, took his small kit of basic tools from the shelf. He always took it out of habit, the way some people always take a coat, and he followed Senna out into the pale afternoon. The alley behind the grain storage building was not far. 3 streets over, then one narrow turn between 2 collapsed walls. By the time they arrived, a small group of locals had already gathered at the entrance to the alley. 7 or 8 of them, different species, all standing at a careful distance. None of them were going in. Elias looked past them. He understood immediately why nobody was moving. The creature lying in the dust of the alley was enormous. Even collapsed on its side, even with its wings folded flat and its long neck stretched out along the ground, it took up nearly the entire width of the alley. Its scales were dark, a deep color somewhere between brown and black, but many of them were cracked or missing entirely, leaving patches of raw damaged skin beneath. Its breathing was visible from a distance. Each breath lifted and dropped its side in a slow, labored way that looked like it was costing a great deal of effort. It was a Dracary. Elias had never seen one in person before, though he had seen images. They were a proud species. Ancient. They did not appear on dying border planets without very serious reasons. They did not collapse in dusty alleys. Something had gone very wrong for this one, and very recently, and the evidence of it was written across its body in old wounds that had clearly not been properly treated. One of the locals near Elias, a heavy-set Vorn male with his arms crossed, spoke without looking away from the alley. He said they should leave it. He said getting involved with a Dracary was asking for trouble, wounded or not. He said when it died they could figure out what to do, but until then the smart move was to stay back and stay clear. Nobody disagreed with him. Then the dragon moved. Not much. Just the long neck shifting slightly in the dust, the great head turning a fraction of an inch. The mouth opened. A sound came out, low and cracked and barely there, shaped around something that took what seemed like enormous effort. 2 words. Cord. Elias Cord. The name hung in the dry air of the alley. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Several of the locals turned to look at each other, confused. 1 or 2 of them looked around, as though the person being named might be standing somewhere nearby and might like to step forward and take responsibility for this. Elias was already walking into the alley. He moved past the edge of the gathered locals without hurrying, without hesitating, without saying anything to any of them. He walked the length of the alley through the pale dust, and he crouched down beside the great dark head of the wounded dragon, and he rested one hand lightly on the ground nearby, not touching, just present. The enormous eye nearest to him opened very slowly. It was amber-colored, that eye. Deep amber like old wood in good light. It found his face and stayed there. The dragon's voice, when it came, was barely more than a breath shaped into words. I did not think you would come. Elias looked back at him steadily. His voice was quiet and even and entirely calm. You said my name, he said. That was enough. Getting the dragon off the street was not easy. It took 11 people, 3 lengths of old cargo rope, a flat wooden loading board that Elias found leaning against the back wall of an abandoned storage unit, and about 2 hours of very slow, very careful work. Several of those 11 people complained the entire time. One of them left halfway through. But Elias kept at it, quietly directing, quietly problem-solving, never raising his voice, never showing frustration, and eventually, somehow, Vareth was inside. The space they moved him into was the empty building directly beside Elias's workshop. It had been a storage room once, for grain or equipment or something else that no longer existed on Vareth's edge. The floor was bare stone covered in old sawdust that had drifted in from Elias's side over the years. The ceiling was high enough. The door was wide enough, barely. It smelled like dry wood and old dust and not much else. It was not a medical facility. It was not even close to a medical facility. But it was what they had. Elias sent Senna to knock on a specific door 3 streets away. He gave her a very simple message to deliver. The message was this: there is a wounded Dracary who will die before morning if nobody helps, and I am asking for your help, and I would not ask if there was any other option. The door belonged to Marin. Marin was a Thurvian, an insectoid species, slender and precise, with 4 thin arms and eyes that could see in almost complete darkness. She had been a physician in a real hospital on a real world once. Before a series of events she did not discuss with anyone brought her to Vareth's edge with 2 bags of medical equipment and a very firm policy of keeping to herself. She was not unfriendly exactly. She was just careful. She kept her circle small and her door closed and her business her own. When Senna delivered the message, Marin stood in her doorway for a long moment without speaking. Then she went back inside, picked up her medical bag and followed Senna through the dark streets without a single word of complaint. She worked through the night. The wounds on Vareth's body were numerous and serious. Most of them were old, caused by some kind of energy weapon, the kind used in military engagements fired at close range. They had not been properly cleaned or closed. Some of them had been roughly sealed, maybe by the dragon himself in whatever way he could manage while traveling. Infection had set into several of them deeply. Marin worked with the quiet, focused efficiency of someone who had done difficult things in difficult conditions many times before and had simply decided that emotion was not useful in those moments. She did not say much while she worked. She asked for light when she needed it. She asked for water twice. She named instruments when she needed them passed to her. Elias provided all of these things. He stayed beside Vareth the entire night. Not in the way of someone performing a duty or waiting out an obligation, but in the way of someone who had decided this was where he should be and felt no need to examine that decision further. He kept the light steady when Marin needed it. He kept a bowl of clean water close. When Vareth shifted or made sounds of pain, Elias would put one hand near the dragon's head, not forcing contact, just making himself present, and speak in a low, even voice about nothing in particular. The weather. The toy he had been carving that afternoon. The way the dust moved differently in this part of the street compared to the market area. It seemed like a strange thing to do. It seemed to help. Grawl arrived sometime around midnight. He appeared in the doorway without announcement, a younger Dracari much smaller than Vareth but still enormous by human standards. His scales were a dark gray, and several of them along his left side were scarred and slightly discolored, the mark of old injuries poorly healed. He had the bearing of a soldier, straight, contained, watchful. His eyes moved across the room quickly, taking everything in. The wounded elder. The insectoid physician. The human kneeling in sawdust beside the dragon's head. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway and watched. Nobody asked him to leave. Nobody asked him to explain himself. Elias glanced at him once, nodded in a neutral way and went back to what he was doing. Grawl stayed in the doorway. It was close to the third hour of the night when Varetha's condition shifted. Not for the worse. Marin had done enough by then to pull him back from the immediate edge, but into something between sleep and wakefulness, a feverish middle state where the body is exhausted but the mind keeps surfacing. His breathing had steadied to something less alarming. His eyes opened and closed slowly, not fully focusing on anything. Elias was sitting with his back against the stone wall beside the dragon's head, his legs stretched out in front of him, when Varetha's claws moved. They moved slowly, searching the air near the ground the way a sleeping person's hand might reach for something without fully waking. Elias shifted closer and let the claws find his arm. They closed around it, not hard, not with pressure, just contact. Just grip. Then Vareth spoke. His voice was rough and low and came in pieces with long pauses between them, like he was pulling each word up from somewhere deep. He said, "I could not carry them all the way." Elias stayed still. He did not ask what that meant yet. He let the silence hold for a moment. Varetha's eyes found his face. Something in them was urgent even through the fever and the exhaustion. He said, "The children." The word landed differently than any other word had that night. Marin's hands slowed. Grawl straightened in the doorway. Vareth told them, in broken pieces, with long pauses and several moments where the words stopped and his eyes closed and everyone in the room stayed very still waiting for him to come back. He told them what he had been doing. There were children. 11 of them. Orphans from multiple species, displaced by the old conflict, with no legal status and no formal records and no one coming for them. He had found them in a temporary holding structure that was not going to hold much longer. He had been moving them, quietly, through routes that avoided official checkpoints toward somewhere safer. He had been doing it slowly, in stages, because moving 11 children of different species across a fractured border region without attracting attention required patience and care. He had not made it. His old wounds had caught up with him. 2 days from Varetha's edge, in the cave systems under a region of broken rock that the locals called the Hollow, he had settled the children as safely as he could, left them what food and water he was carrying, and pressed on alone to find help. He had not known if he would reach anyone. He had not known if he would reach the town at all. He had known one name. He said, "I left them, enough for perhaps 3 days, maybe 4 if they are careful." His grip on Elias's arm tightened slightly. "They are frightened. The little ones, especially." The room was silent for a long moment. Marin set down her instrument and pressed her 4 thin fingers briefly to the bridge of her nose. Then she picked the instrument back up and went back to work without comment. Her feelings about the situation were entirely clear without any words attached to them. Grawl had not moved from the doorway. But his posture had changed. Something in the careful soldier's stillness had shifted into something less closed. Elias gently loosened Varetha's grip from his arm and set the great clawed hand down carefully on the ground. He stayed kneeling for a moment. Then he stood up slowly. He brushed the sawdust off his knees with both hands, The same practical gesture he used when he finished a long carving session and was ready to move on to the next thing. He looked at Marin. He said, "Will he survive until we get back?" Marin did not look up from her work. She said, "If he does what I tell him and does not move, possibly yes." "Tell him I said that." Elias turned and looked at Grawl in the doorway. He did not ask for help. He did not explain the situation in detail or make any kind of case. He just said, in the same quiet, steady voice he used for everything, "I'm going to find the children. You can come if you want." Then he went back to his workshop and began packing a bag. Grawl stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the space where the human had been standing. Then he looked at Verith. The old dragon's eyes were closed again, breathing slow and labored but present. Grawl exhaled, a long breath through his nose that moved the dust on the floor near his feet. "You are a very strange human," he said to the empty doorway. From the next room, without any pause, Elias's voice came back quietly. "So I've been told." They left before sunrise. Elias had his bag packed and was standing outside the workshop in the dark when Grawl arrived. The dragon said nothing about the hour. Elias said nothing about the fact that Grawl had come at all. They simply stood together in the quiet pre-dawn cold for a moment, two very different creatures with one shared direction, and then Elias started walking and Grawl fell into step behind him. They made it approximately 4 streets before Senna appeared. She stepped out from the shadow of a doorway with her small bag already on her back and all 4 arms crossed in a posture that made her position on the matter entirely clear before anyone said a single word. Elias stopped. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the particular expression of someone who has already had every version of this argument in their head and won all of them. Elias considered pointing out that she was 7 years old and the terrain ahead was broken and dangerous. He considered pointing out that her family would worry. He considered several other reasonable and practical objections. Then he looked at her face and understood that none of those things were going to make any difference at all. He nodded once and kept walking. Grawl looked down at the small 4-armed child falling into step beside the human. He made a low sound that was not quite a word. Then he kept walking too. The 3 of them left Veritha's edge as the first pale light was beginning to show at the edge of the sky. The wilderness beyond the town was not the kind of wilderness that had trees or water or soft ground. It was the kind that had been broken by conflict and then left alone long enough for the breaking to become permanent. Old blast craters had filled with pale dust and become shallow bowls in the earth. Collapsed structures, remnants of outposts and supply depots, jutted from the ground at wrong angles, metal and stone fused together by old heat. The road, such as it was, had cracked into sections that shifted slightly underfoot, like the ground itself was not fully committed to staying in one place. Grawl moved through it easily. His weight and size that might have been a disadvantage in a city were simply power out here. He stepped over obstacles that Elias had to climb and crossed ground that would have slowed most creatures without any visible effort. Elias moved more slowly but more carefully. He watched where he put his feet. He noticed things. A section of ground that sounded hollow when he stepped near it, a leaning piece of old structure that was balanced in a way that would not survive being touched, a path through a cluster of debris that looked blocked but was actually passable if you went left instead of right. He did not announce these observations. He simply adjusted his path and said quietly when it mattered which way to go. Senna was faster than either of them had expected. She was small and light and her 4 arms gave her a kind of balance that was almost unsettling to watch. She could catch herself in 4 directions at once, could grip a surface with 2 hands while her feet found new footing, could move across unstable terrain with the quick careful energy of something built for exactly this kind of movement. She kept up without difficulty. After the first hour she was occasionally slightly ahead. Grawl watched this for a while. Then he watched Elias. The human did not complain. This was the thing Grawl kept noticing. The terrain was genuinely hard and genuinely unpleasant, and Elias was not young and not built for wilderness travel, and he did not say a single word about any of it. He just kept moving. When he needed to stop and drink water he stopped, drank and started again. When he stumbled on a broken section of road he caught himself and kept going. There was no performance of toughness in it, no clenched jaw or forced expression. He simply seemed to have decided that forward was the direction and was continuing in that direction until something actually stopped him. Around midday they rested in the shadow of a collapsed wall. Elias shared food from his bag, simple things practical enough for 3. Senna ate quickly and then sat watching the horizon with her large dark eyes. Grawl ate what Elias offered without comment, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement. After a while Grawl spoke. He asked Elias directly, why did he care about Drakri children? He said it plainly, without accusation but without softening either. He said that humans and Drackery had no history of friendship, no shared debt, no reason for this kind of involvement. He wanted to understand the logic of it. Elias thought about this honestly. He did not answer immediately, and he did not answer with anything rehearsed. He said, "Children do not belong to history. They just belong to whoever shows up." Grawl was quiet for a moment. He did not agree out loud. He did not disagree either. He looked at the horizon the way Senna was looking at it, and then he stood up and indicated with a tilt of his head that they should keep moving. They moved. The second half of the first day took them into the region approaching the hollow. The ground here was worse, more heavily damaged by whatever had happened during the conflict, with large sections simply absent, dropped into lower levels of terrain that required careful navigation around the edges. The light was getting thinner as the day wore on, the pale sun of Varitha's edge dropping toward the horizon and taking what warmth it offered with it. They made camp in a protected corner formed by two fallen walls. Elias built a small heat source from components in his bag. Nothing complicated, just enough to keep the cold from becoming dangerous. Senna fell asleep quickly, curled small and neat with all four arms tucked in. Grawl settled into a stillness that might have been sleep or might have been something else. Elias sat for a while looking at the sky, which on Varitha's edge was a deep gray-purple at night with very few stars visible through the dust in the upper atmosphere. Then he slept too. The second day was harder. The hollow began properly about 3 hours into the morning's travel. A region of collapsed rock formations and old tunnel systems, the ground riddled with gaps and unstable sections, the remains of what had been an underground supply network before the conflict destroyed the surface structures above it. Navigation required constant attention. Several times the ground shifted under their feet in ways that made all three of them stop completely and wait to see what would happen next. It was late in the second day, with the light already beginning to fail, when they reached the tunnel. It was the only route through to the cave section Varith had described. A passageway through a collapsed rock formation, low and narrow, that had apparently been passable when Varith came through with the children. It was not passable now. At some point since then, a day ago, maybe two, a section of the ceiling had come down. Not completely. There was still a gap. But the remaining structure above the gap was unstable in a way that was obvious even at a distance. Large pieces of rock were balanced against each other at angles that would not survive being disturbed. Grawl studied it for a moment. Then he stepped forward and put his hands against the largest piece of fallen rock and pushed. The ceiling shifted. Several smaller pieces dropped. The gap narrowed. A deep cracking sound moved through the rock above them like a warning. Grawl stepped back. Elias was already crouching beside the debris pile with his tool kit open on the ground next to him. He was looking at the structure the way he looked at broken toys, not at what was wrong with it but at what was still holding and how that holding worked and what could be added to make the holding stronger. He started with a long piece of flat metal from the debris around them, part of an old structural support, still solid. He worked it carefully into position against the largest unstable piece above the gap, bracing it against a more stable section below. Then a second piece, angled differently, creating a point of contact that redistributed the weight. Then two smaller pieces wedged into specific gaps that he had identified by pressing on the rock lightly with his hands and listening to what moved and what did not. It took a long time. Grawl watched without speaking. Senna watched with her arms wrapped around herself in the cold. Piece by piece. Adjustment by adjustment. Each small correction making the next one possible. Finally Elias sat back on his heels and looked at what he had built. He pressed one hand against the structure. It did not move. He pressed harder. Still nothing. He started through the gap. Grawl said, "You are a toy maker." Elias kept moving through the gap. He said, "Toys teach me how things hold together." On the other side of the tunnel the cave opened into a larger space. It was dark and cold and smelled of dust and something else, the particular smell of living creatures in a closed space. Elias took the small light from his bag and held it up. In the back of the cave, pressed together in a close group for warmth, were 11 children. Different sizes, different species, eyes wide and frightened and fixed on the light and the figures coming through the tunnel. Some of them had been crying. Some of them had gone past crying into a dry, exhausted stillness that was somehow worse. Nobody moved for a moment. Then the smallest Drackery child in the group, no bigger than a large dog, scales still the soft unfixed color of a young one, eyes enormous in the low light, stepped forward from the group. One careful step. Then another. The child looked up at Elias. The voice was thin and exhausted and very careful, like something being held together with great effort. "Did the old one send you?" Elias crouched down slowly until he was at eye level with the child. He looked at the small serious face looking back at him. His voice was quiet and even and completely certain. "He remembered your names?" he said. The child's eyes filled slowly the way deep water fills a hollow, not spilling yet, just rising. Behind the small drakery, one of the other children made a sound. Then another. The tight, frightened group began to loosen at the edges, small bodies shifting, the particular held breath tension of children who have been trying very hard to be brave beginning, finally, carefully, to let go. Elias stayed where he was at eye level in the cold and the dark. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The first problem was simple. 11 children who had been sitting in a cold dark cave for 2 days, surviving on rationed food and shared warmth and the particular kind of quiet courage that children develop when there is no other option. Those children did not move easily. Not at first. Their legs worked. Their bodies were cold and stiff but intact. That was not the problem. The problem was that they had been waiting so long, in so much uncertainty, that the idea of moving felt dangerous. Like something that could be taken away. Like if they stood up and started walking toward something better, the something better might disappear before they reached it. Elias understood this without being told. He did not say, "Come on, let's go, we need to move, it's time to leave." He did not clap his hands or use a loud encouraging voice or make promises about how everything was going to be fine. He simply sat down on the cave floor among them and opened his bag and took out the food he had brought and passed it around. He let them eat. He let the warmth of having someone present settle over the group like a blanket. While they ate, he talked quietly. Not about the journey ahead. Not about what had happened or what was coming. He talked about Vareth. He told them that the old dragon had made it. That he was being cared for. That he had been asking about them. He told them this in simple, direct words without decoration because simple and direct was what they needed and he seemed to know that. The small drakery child, who told Elias his name was Veth, said it very seriously, like it was important that the name be recorded, sat close to Elias's side while he talked. Not touching. Just close. The way a cold creature moves near a heat source without quite committing to it. After a while the children began to stand up on their own. Moving 11 children of different species, different sizes, and different physical needs through the hollow and back toward Varetha's edge was nothing like the journey out. Elias had understood this in theory before they left. He understood it in a much more complete way now. The youngest ones tired quickly. There were 2 who were too small to maintain the pace that the terrain demanded, and Elias carried them. One against his chest, one on his back, secured with the length of cord from his bag. He was not a large man and they were not weightless and the ground was still broken and difficult. He carried them anyway. He did not adjust his expression or his voice or his steady forward movement to indicate that this was hard. Grawl watched this for approximately 20 minutes before he reached over without comment and took the child from Elias's back. He held the small creature in the crook of one enormous arm with a careful awkwardness that suggested he had never held a small child before and was working it out as he went. The child, a tiny Keth, one of the same species as Senna, looked up at the enormous scarred dragon holding her and after a moment of very serious consideration apparently decided this was acceptable and went to sleep. Grawl looked at the sleeping child in his arm. Something moved across his face that he did not put into words. Senna took charge of the middle group, the children who could walk but needed someone to keep them focused and moving. She was 7 years old and small even by Keth standards, but she had a natural authority that expressed itself in practical directions delivered in a tone that did not really invite argument. She counted the children in her group every few minutes. She kept them together. When one of them stumbled, she was there before anyone else. Elias kept the pace, not fast, not slow, but continuous. This was the thing that mattered most in terrain like this. Not speed. Continuity. Stopping and starting cost more energy than steady slow movement, especially for tired small bodies that were still cold from 2 days in a cave. He kept them moving with quiet consistent energy and when the movement threatened to stall he did something small to restart it. The games were Veth's idea, originally. Or rather, Veth asked Elias something, a quiet question while they walked, about how much further it was. Elias gave him an honest answer about distance and then, because Veth's face did the thing that children's faces do when an honest answer is discouraging, he immediately followed it with a question back. He asked Veth if he knew how to count steps in the drakery way. Veth said he did not know there was a drakery way. Elias said he wasn't entirely sure there was either, but they could probably invent one. This became a game that spread through the group over the next hour without Elias appearing to design it that way. Different counting systems. Different rhythms. A competition to find the most interesting rock while still walking forward. A question passed from child to child about what they would eat first when they reached the town. Small things. things that gave the mind somewhere to be other than in the difficulty of the present moment. Grawl observed all of this with an expression that had gone from watchful to something quieter and less defended. They were 4 hours into the return journey, moving through the central section of the hollow where the collapsed rock formations rose up on both sides and the path between them narrowed, when Elias noticed them. 3 figures. Moving along the ridge above to the right. Parallel to the group's direction. Keeping pace. He did not stop walking. He did not change his expression. He said quietly from the side of his mouth to Grawl, 3 on the ridge, right side, been there for about 10 minutes. Grawl did not look immediately. He waited 30 seconds, then glanced up with the casual ease of someone looking at the sky. His expression did not change either. But his posture shifted in a way that was very slight and very clear to anyone who knew what a Drakri soldier's posture looked like when he had identified a threat. The 3 figures came down from the ridge and blocked the path ahead. They were humanoid, 2 humans and 1 species Elias did not immediately recognize, dressed in the kind of practical dark clothing that was useful for not being seen and not being identified. They were armed. Not heavily but visibly. The weapons were at their sides, not raised, which was a specific kind of message. We have these. We are comfortable with them. This does not need to become anything it doesn't need to become. The one in the center, a human male, broad, with a face that had the flattened quality of someone who had made many bad decisions professionally, looked past Elias at the children. His eyes moved across the group with a counting quality. Then he looked at Elias. He said they were looking for a group of unregistered minors traveling without documentation in this region. He said there were people with a legal interest in the welfare of these children. He said the sensible thing for everyone was to hand them over now and avoid complications. He said this pleasantly. That was the part that was designed to be frightening. The pleasantness. All the weapons were pointed at Grawl. This was what Elias had expected. A Drakri was the obvious threat. The middle-aged human with sawdust on his jacket was not the thing they were watching. Elias stepped forward. Not to the side. Not slightly. He stepped directly forward and placed himself between the 3 scouts and the 11 children behind him. He stood there with his hands at his sides and his jacket dusty from 2 days of travel and his face entirely calm. He spoke in a quiet and completely certain voice. He said that these children were under his formal protection. He said their location and condition had been documented and transmitted to the Interspecies Welfare Authority and the Border Accord Commission before the group left Veritha's Edge. He said the Interspecies Accord, specifically the refugee minor provisions established after the border conflict, applied to every child standing behind him. He said that any attempt to remove them would be logged against specific registered names. He said all of this without pause, without hesitation, without any change in his expression or his voice. Like he was reciting facts. Like the facts were simply the facts and he found the whole situation mildly tedious. There was no documentation. There was no transmission. There was no registered complaint. He had packed his bag in the middle of the night and walked into the wilderness with a dragon and a 7-year-old. He had nothing. He sounded like he had everything. The 3 scouts looked at him. The one in the center was running a calculation behind his eyes, the kind of calculation that people who do dangerous things professionally are always running. Risk versus reward. Certainty versus uncertainty. The human in front of him was a variable he had not accounted for. The calm was wrong. People who were bluffing did not sound like that. The hesitation lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds Grawl moved. Not toward the scouts. Not aggressively. He simply stepped forward and to the left until he was standing directly beside Elias. Shoulder to shoulder. Or as close to shoulder as the geometry of a large Drakri and a medium human allowed. He did not say anything. He did not need to. 1 calm human and 1 enormous scarred dragon. Side by side. Looking at 3 scouts who had just recalculated their situation and found it considerably less favorable than it had appeared 30 seconds ago. The scout in the center looked at the dragon. Then at the human. Then at the dragon again. Then he made a small gesture to the 2 beside him and the 3 of them stepped off the path and walked away back toward the ridge without a word. Just like that. Elias watched them go until they were out of sight. Then he turned and looked at the children behind him. 11 faces, wide-eyed, very still. He said, "Okay, let's keep moving." And they did. Grawl fell back into step beside him. After a moment he said, "You had no documentation." Elias was already picking the pace back up, the small careful rhythm of forward motion restored as though it had never been interrupted. He said, "No." But they didn't know that. Grawl was quiet for a long time after that. Not the watchful silence of before. Something different. Something that was working something out. He still had the small Keth child asleep in the crook of his arm. He did not put her down for the rest of the journey. There was no meeting about it. No discussion, no vote, no moment where someone stood up and announced that things were going to be different now. Elias did not gather the people of Varitha's Edge and make a speech about responsibility or community or doing the right thing. He was not that kind of person, and this was not that kind of story. He simply looked at the empty building beside his workshop the morning after they returned, with 11 children sleeping inside it on every flat surface that could be made comfortable, and he went and found a broom. That was how it started. The building had been empty for 2 years. It had collected dust and small debris and the particular kind of stillness that empty spaces develop when nothing living has been inside them for a long time. The roof had one section that needed attention. 2 of the windows had no covering. The floor was stone, cold and bare. Elias swept it. Then he looked at the roof section and went to find materials to fix it. Then he came back and fixed it. Then he looked at the windows and went to find coverings for them. This process repeated itself over the following days in the same quiet, methodical way that he approached everything: identify the next problem, solve the next problem, move to the one after that. He did not ask for help directly. He never quite did. But word moved through Varitha's Edge the way word always moved through small communities, quietly, person to person, carried on the current of ordinary life. People heard things. People came to look. Some of them left again. Some of them picked up something and helped without being asked and then came back the next day. Maren came back. She told herself and anyone who asked that she was coming to check on Varith. This was true. She checked on Varith every day with the focused professional attention of someone who had invested significant effort in keeping a patient alive and intended to see that investment through. But after checking on Varith, she would move through the building and she would notice things: the way the children who had respiratory sensitivities were placed too near the dusty window, the way the water supply needed to be organized differently to avoid contamination, and she would fix those things. And then she would come back the next day. After 2 weeks, she had reorganized the back room into something that functioned as a basic medical space. She had not announced this. It was simply what the back room had become. Grawl stayed. He told himself and Elias and anyone who commented on it that he was staying because Varith needed a Dracari presence nearby, because the old dragon's recovery was uncertain and Grawl felt a responsibility to his elder. This was also true as far as it went. But Grawl was also doing other things. He was moving heavy materials that no one else on Varitha's Edge could move easily. He was standing in the street outside the building in the evenings with the particular stillness of a trained soldier maintaining a perimeter, which had the side effect of making the building one of the safest locations on the planet. He was learning, slowly and with great seriousness, the names of all 11 children. He learned Veth's name first. This was partly because Veth was the oldest of the Dracari children and therefore the one Grawl felt most immediately responsible for, and partly because Veth had a way of appearing beside Grawl at unexpected moments and asking him questions about things with the focused curiosity of someone who had decided that this particular scarred soldier was an interesting subject of study. Grawl answered the questions. He was not warm about it exactly, but he answered them. Veth was also following Elias everywhere. This began on the second day after their return and showed no signs of stopping. Wherever Elias went in the building or the workshop or the street immediately outside, Veth appeared. Not intrusively, he did not interrupt or demand attention. He simply positioned himself nearby and watched. He watched with the serious, ancient-looking eyes that young Dracari had, eyes that looked like they belonged in a much older face, taking in everything Elias did with careful, complete attention. Elias did not tell Veth to go play with the other children. He did not suggest that watching a middle-aged human fix roof sections and sort through materials was not the most interesting way to spend an afternoon. He simply went about his work and let Veth watch and occasionally explained what he was doing when it seemed like an explanation would be useful. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after their return, Elias sat down at his workbench in the workshop and picked up his carving tools. He had not had time to carve anything since before the day Senna had run through his door. He turned a piece of pale wood over in his hands for a moment, feeling the grain of it, and then he became aware that Veth was standing beside the workbench watching him with an expression of concentrated interest. Elias looked at the small dragon. Then he looked at his wood supply. Then he selected a second piece, smaller, softer wood, easier to work, and set it on the bench in front of the empty stool beside him. He put a small safe carving tool next to it. He did not say, "Would you like to try?" He did not explain the process or set expectations. He just put the wood and the tool on the bench and went back to his own piece. Veth climbed onto the stool. He looked at the wood. He looked at the tool. He picked up the tool with the careful seriousness of someone handling something important and looked at Elias's hands to see how they held it, and then adjusted his own grip to match. Then he began. They sat together in the quiet of the workshop for the rest of that afternoon. The light came through the window in its pale way and moved slowly across the bench as the hours passed. Elias worked on his piece, a small bird, the same kind he had been making the day everything started. Veth worked on his. The sounds of the building next door came through the wall in a soft continuous way, children's voices, Senna issuing instructions about something, Marin's precise tones in the back room, the occasional deep movement of Grawl in the street outside. The building was becoming something. Not quickly, not officially, but in the real way that things become what they are, through daily use, through the accumulation of small moments, through people returning to a place because it had become the place they returned to. After a long time Veth held up what he had made. It was small. It was uneven. One side was considerably different in shape from the other side. There were tool marks going in several directions that suggested a fairly eventful working process. As an object it was difficult to immediately categorize. Elias set down his own work and looked at Veth's piece with the full serious attention he gave to everything. He asked what it was. Veth looked at the object in his hand and then at Elias with complete confidence. He said, "It is you." Elias looked at the small lumpy carving for another moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone who could now clearly see it. He said, "Yes." He said it looked exactly right. He said Veth should put it on the shelf. Veth put it on the shelf with great care, in the spot Elias indicated, among the other small figures there. He stepped back and looked at it in its place. His tail moved in the slow satisfied way that meant something good, and then he climbed back onto the stool and picked up the tool again to start something new. It was on an afternoon not long after this that Vareth spoke to Elias about the name. The old dragon was recovering slowly but genuinely. He could lift his head without effort now. He could hold a conversation without the words breaking apart from exhaustion. He was not what he had been before his injuries, that Elias suspected would take much longer, if it happened fully at all, but he was present and coherent and his amber eyes had regained the quality of focus they had lacked in those first terrible nights. Elias had come in to sit with him in the early evening as he did most days. He had brought water and sat down on the low stool beside the dragon's head and they had been quiet together for a while in the comfortable way of two creatures who had moved past the need to fill silence. Then Vareth said, "You never asked me." Elias looked at him. Vareth said, "You never asked how I knew your name." From the first moment. "You never asked." Elias thought about this. He said, "I figured you would tell me when it mattered." Vareth made the low sound that was his version of a long slow breath. He was quiet for a moment, looking at Elias with those deep amber eyes. Then he told him. It was not recent. It was decades back, so far back that Elias had been a young man, not yet the middle-aged quiet person he had become. He had been doing volunteer aid work on a different ruined world, a planet recovering from a different kind of catastrophe. There had been a shelter that failed, a structural collapse during a particularly bad environmental event. Inside the shelter, among other things, had been a clutch of Dracary eggs. Unattended. The temperature regulation had gone down with the structural systems. Dracary eggs that lose temperature do not recover. The embryos inside them are sensitive in ways that adult Dracary are not. Without consistent warmth they fail. It does not take long. Elias had been in the area. He had understood the situation. And he had stayed. 3 days. He had stayed for 3 days, improvising heating elements from whatever components he could find in the damaged facility, monitoring the temperature, adjusting, correcting, starting again when something failed. He had not slept properly. He had not left. He had not known if it was working until the first egg moved on the 3rd day. He had not known that anyone was watching him. But someone had been. An elder Dracary, old even then, passing through the damaged world on different business, had seen a young human through a broken wall, kneeling beside a clutch of eggs in a ruined building, carefully holding a makeshift heating element steady with both hands in the middle of the night. The elder had watched for a long time. Then she had remembered his face. She had found his name. And when she was old and Vareth was young and she was passing things worth keeping to those who would carry them forward, she had passed that name. The human who stayed. Vareth said, "She told me that if I ever found a situation where no one was moving and something needed doing, I should think of that name." The workshop was very quiet. Elias sat with this for a long moment. He looked at his hands, the same hands older now with more marks on them. Then he picked up the small carving he had brought in with him and turned it over slowly. He said, "I just didn't want the eggs to get cold." Vareth looked at him. The amber eyes were warm and steady and very old. The low rumbling sound came from deep in the dragon's chest. The Dracary laugh, the one that sounded like distant thunder heard through stone walls. He said, very softly, "That is exactly why I remembered." Word traveled slowly on Veritha's edge. There were no broadcast systems anymore, no official channels, no networks pushing information from one place to another. What there was people. Travelers passing through who saw something unexpected and mentioned it to the next person they met. Traders who stopped at the small market and noticed that the building beside the toy workshop had lights in it now, and children's voices, and a scarred Dracary soldier standing quietly in the street outside like he had decided this was where he belonged. Ship crews who landed for resupply and walked through the streets and came back to their ships with something extra in their accounts of the place. Word traveled slowly. But it traveled. It reached the Interspecies Welfare Authority approximately 6 weeks after Elias had first knelt beside a dying dragon in a dusty alley. Not through any formal report. Nobody on Veritha's edge had filed anything. It arrived the way real things arrive at official organizations. Sideways, through the account of someone who had been somewhere and seen something and mentioned it to someone else who happened to have the right connections. A caseworker was assigned. Her name was Ren. She arrived on a small transit vessel on a morning that was, like most mornings on Veritha's edge, pale and dry and quietly cold. She was a human woman, composed and careful, with short gray hair and a document case under one arm and the particular expression of someone who has seen many difficult situations professionally and has learned to observe before concluding. She wore the standard gray of the Welfare Authority. She had a good pen and she used it often. She found the building without difficulty. People in the market directed her without being asked, which itself told her something. Elias was outside when she arrived, replacing a section of the outer wall with materials he had salvaged from a collapsed structure 2 streets away. He was dusty as he always was. He had a tool in one hand and a piece of flatboard in the other. He looked at Ren when she introduced herself and her organization, and he nodded in the mild way he nodded at most things, and he said he would show her around when he finished this section. She said that was fine. She waited. While she waited, she looked at the building and the street, and the small workshop beside it with its door open and the faint smell of sawdust coming from inside. She wrote something in her document case. Then Elias finished the section, put down his tools and showed her around. The building was not large but it was full. 11 children created a considerable amount of life in a space, sound and movement and the particular organized chaos of young creatures with energy and nowhere specific to put it. Senna had developed a system for the daily routine that she implemented with absolute authority and that the other children followed with the pragmatic acceptance of people who understand that someone has to be in charge of things, and Senna is clearly that person. There were sleeping areas, divided by species to account for different temperature and space needs. There was a common area where the children ate together and where, in the afternoons, things that could loosely be described as lessons took place. Marin ran the back room. She had not officially agreed to run the back room. It had simply become hers through the accumulating weight of daily presence and the fact that she was there more hours than not and knew where everything was and had opinions about how it should be organized that were, objectively, correct. Grawl was outside most of the time or moving through the building with the quiet purposeful energy of someone who has found a task that fits them. He had taken on the responsibility of teaching the older children practical navigation, how to read the position of the pale sun, how to identify landmarks, how to find direction in terrain without markers. He conducted these lessons with the seriousness of someone teaching genuinely important skills, which he was, and the children received them with corresponding seriousness. Ren observed all of this. She walked through the building slowly, writing in her document case. She watched Marin in the back room checking on a Keth child who had developed a minor respiratory issue. She watched Grawl outside with 3 of the older children, pointing at the sky and asking them questions about what they saw. She watched Senna organizing the midday meal with the efficiency of someone who has cooked for 11 children enough times to have developed strong feelings about the most effective process. She watched Elias. He moved through the building and the workshop and the street outside in the same way he always had, quietly, steadily, solving the next problem and then the one after that. He carried things. He fixed things. He sat on the floor with the smaller children when they needed someone to sit with them. He had a piece of carving in his pocket most of the time, something small he was working on in the brief moments between other things, and sometimes a child would notice it and he would show them what it was becoming. Veth stayed close to him. This had not changed. The small Dracary followed Elias through the day with the faithful consistent presence of something that has decided where it belongs and has no interest in reconsidering. Sometimes Veth helped with what Elias was doing. Sometimes he just watched. Elias never indicated that either was unwelcome. On the third day, Ren sat down across from Elias at the workbench in the workshop. It was evening. The building next door had quieted into its nighttime sounds, the lower murmur of children settling, Marin's precise voice giving some final instruction in the back room, the deep quiet of Grawl taking up his position outside. The workshop was lit by the small warm light Elias kept on the bench. It smelled like sawdust and wood oil. Ren set her document case on the bench and looked at Elias directly. She said she had spent 3 days looking at what was happening in this building on this street on this dying border planet. She said she had looked at it carefully and written a great deal about it. She said that in her professional experience, which was considerable, what was here was real. Not a constructed thing, not a performance, but something that had grown because the conditions for it had been created by specific people making specific choices. Then she asked him what he wanted. She said it plainly. Funding. Recognition. Official support structures. A formal role within the welfare authorities network. Resources. She listed the things her organization could offer in the flat tone of someone reading a menu, letting him hear the options without putting weight on any of them. Elias listened to all of it. Then he was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking rather than preparing to speak. He turned the small carving in his pocket over in his hand without taking it out. He said he wanted one thing. He said he wanted the shelter to have formal registered status under the interspecies accord. He said he wanted the 11 children living in that building to have legal protection, documented, registered, official, so that no one could ever come for them again. No mercenary scouts. No people with claimed legal interests. No one. He said he wanted them to be, in the eyes of every authority that mattered, permanently and completely safe. Ren looked at him for a moment. Then she opened her document case and picked up her pen and began to write. It took her the rest of that evening and part of the following morning. The documentation for formal shelter registration under the interspecies accord was not simple, and Ren was thorough. She asked Elias questions when she needed information, and he answered them accurately and completely and without embellishment. By midday of the 4th day, she transmitted the completed filing from her vessel's communication system. The shelter on Varitha's edge became real in the eyes of interstellar law. Ren left the next morning. Before she boarded her vessel, she stood for a moment in the street outside the building and looked at it. The repaired walls, the covered windows, the sounds coming from inside, the small carved figure that Veth had hung beside the door, lumpy and uneven and clearly meant to be a person. Then she picked up her document case and walked to her ship. That afternoon Varith asked to be moved. His recovery had continued to the point where movement was possible, though not easy. With Graal's help and Marin's supervision and a process that took most of the afternoon, he was repositioned in the large common area of the shelter building where he could be among the children rather than separated from them. He settled with the slow, careful relief of someone arriving somewhere they should have been sooner. When the children gathered around him, as they did immediately, drawn by proximity and the particular gravity that the old dragon had always generated in them, he looked at them for a long moment. All 11 of them, different sizes and species and faces, the strange collection of surviving children that life and one determined old Drackery had assembled in this place. He told them he wanted to tell them something important. His voice was still rough, still slower than it had been, but it was steady and it carried. The children settled into listening without being asked. He told them about a name. He told them about a young human on a ruined world decades ago, kneeling in a broken building through 3 days and 3 nights, keeping a clutch of Drackery eggs warm with improvised equipment and his own stubborn refusal to leave. He told them this human had not known anyone was watching. He had not done it to be seen. He had done it because the eggs were cold and he was there, and those 2 facts were enough reason. He told them that an elder had carried that name for decades and had passed it to Varith like something worth keeping. He told them that when his own wounds had taken him down in a dusty alley on this planet, that name had been the one he reached for. He said, the measure of a person is not what they do when others are watching. It is what they do when no one is watching. When there is nothing to gain. When the only reason to stay is that something needs doing and you are the one who is there. The common room was very quiet. Veth was sitting beside Elias as he usually was. He had been listening to Varith with the complete focused attention he gave to things that mattered to him. Now he turned and looked up at Elias with his serious ancient eyes. He asked, will they remember your name too? Like Varith did? Elias looked down at him. The workshop light was coming through the doorway in its pale, steady way. Around them the shelter held its sounds, breathing, small movements, the particular full quiet of 11 children listening. He reached over and ruffled the small dragon's head scales gently. The scales were soft still, the way young Drackery scales were, and they shifted under his hand like the pages of something just beginning to be written. He said, I don't need them to remember my name. I just need you all to be okay. Veth looked at him for another moment with those eyes that were too old for his face. Then he leaned very slightly against Elias's side, just the small warm pressure of contact, nothing more, and turned back to listen to Vareth. Elias put his hand back in his pocket where the small carving was. He turned it over once. Then he left it there and sat still and listened too. Later that night, after the children were settled and Marin had finished her rounds and Grawl had taken up his quiet position outside, Elias went back to his workshop alone. He lit the small bench light. He sat down. He took out the carving he had been working on and looked at it. A small dragon, nearly finished, the wings just right, the expression on the tiny face something between serious and peaceful. He set it on the shelf. It sat beside Veth's lumpy carving of a person, the two of them together in the warm small light. Around them on the shelf were other figures. Ones Elias had made, ones the children had made in the weeks since, each one different, each one made by different hands at different levels of skill, all of them kept in the same place. He looked at the shelf for a moment. Then he picked up a new piece of wood and his carving tool and began. Outside the workshop the shelter was quiet and full and safe. The pale night of Varetha's edge settled over the street. Inside the small warm light continued steady at the bench, and the sound of a carving tool moving carefully overwood continued with it, small and consistent and unhurried, the sound of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing else they needed to be doing. He had not gone looking for any of it. He had only gone because someone had said his name. And that, in the end, had been exactly enough.